Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. This is Coach Chat with Cynthia and Paula. So excited for everyone who's joining us. Let us know who you are in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from. This is part two of uh, Paula and my series, Why Companies Fail to Retain People of Color. We're really excited to dive into our 10 solutions for companies that want to improve in this area, which arguably should be all companies. So we're really hyped to get into it. Before we do, I would love if Paula could introduce herself to all of you, and again, let us know who you are in the chat. We'd love to interact with folks. Paula.
Hi, everyone. I am Paula Edgar. I am an attorney, although I don't practice law anymore. I am a full time diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant and speaker. I also do professional development through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I primarily work with the legal sector, although I work across sectors, and particularly with leaders and making sure that they have an inclusion lens in order to impact their cultures in a way in which it sticks and people stay.
I love that. That's obviously what we're all about. And welcome to Jason from Denver, Lori from LA. Welcome, welcome. I'm Cynthia Pong, also a former lawyer, so we're very legal in some of the ways that we work. And I'm a career coach and a consultant for organizations that really want to and are invested in supporting their people of color employees. Um, so uh, as we get into it, I would love to get everybody up to speed for those of you who didn't join in part one that we did a couple of weeks ago, and also in the teaser that we did on LinkedIn Audio back in January. I want to get everybody up to speed so that we're not leaving folks behind. And hi, McKenna from Ohio. Somebody from Greater Boston and Massachusetts. I can't see who you are. Jen, Patricia, Yolanda. Welcome, welcome. Keep joining and letting us know who you are. So this is what we already talked about previously in Coach Chat with Cynthia and Paula, why companies fail to retain people of color. We laid out and described the whole problem of what happens and what it's actually like for people of color in organizations that where there's a gap between, say, the DEI training and the actual day-to-day lived reality of folks of color. And then we shared in part one our three of our 10 solutions for companies that want to do better when it comes to retaining their talent of color. And the first of those, which undergirds really all of those solutions, is to ensure that there's adequate resources, time, money, and infrastructure allocated to all of these initiatives. It's not enough if you allow folks to create a DEI committee or a set of ERGs and you give them if functionally $0. So resources, time, money, and infrastructure have to be properly allocated to shore up the resources, and they need to be like a significant percentage of the entire overall operating budget of a company. Number two, and Paul, you may want to jump in on this, is professional development education. So that type of training, it's your specialty, Paula. I'll let you share a little more about that.
Sure. And I want to just do two things before I do that. First of all, I was jamming to the music before we got started, and I want everybody to acknowledge that that music was hitting. It's making my Wednesday much better. And then secondly, want to underscore the money piece, the resources piece, time, money, people, infrastructure, right? All of those things need to be a part of your strategy. And so often people want to go from 0 to 10 without thinking about how you're going to fund all the things that are happening. And so that's an important piece that you should be thinking about as you're creating a strategy in order to help retain folks. So PD and education. What people want in the workplace is to be fully heard and fairly treated. And so within those confines, you also have they want to be able to maximize the opportunity within their spaces, right? So within whatever role they have, what are they doing? How can they do it better? And then how can they potentially see a path for elevation? And the way that you do that is through education, right? Is through making sure that there is a strategy for the role that they're in. What do they need to know? Where are the places and benchmarks in which they can step up? And what do we need to know collectively as a community in order to navigate that? So, oftentimes I will do with an organization, I'll start with unconscious bias training. Why? Because while I would love to start at anti-racism, you can't start there, right? Because you have to get to, right. People have to understand that bias as an underlier is a part of our experience as human beings, and it helps to explain, again, not excuse, but explain some of the ways in which our interactions can be challenged. And so starting there, but then also thinking about what you need to know, communication, best practices, things like that, which I know we're going to get into later. So professional development must be a part of your strategy for making sure people get retained or are retained, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, it's so important that people do have those resources, including the educational ones. And that's why I love, so I mean, I think that's why we get along so well, Paula, is like when we've initially talked and then we're like, we got to do something together. It was like just sharing all the work and impact that you've been making in your consulting and your professional development work inside organizations to transform them. And then real quick, before we get into the new 7 strategies and solutions for today, the third one we talked about was career coaching for employees of color. So just yesterday and today and this whole week, I'm actually talking to a whole new set of folks from a particular company that retained my company to come in and provide career coaching support specifically for their BIPOC employees. And I'm not sure what happened. I think we might have briefly lost Paula, but she'll come back, I'm sure. Hopefully you all can hear me. Let me know if you still see and hear me. Tech issues. So in any event, I've been talking to these folks at this particular national company, and several of them have said, hi Andrea in Spain. Several of them have said, like, I've been wanting to access and tap into career coaching support for years. I just didn't know how. I just didn't have an entry point. And now they have a way in. Yay, Paula is back.
Mercury must be in retrograde. I'm back. It's
As my public speaking coach and friend Rhonda Khan always says, the tech will fail you. And so, we're rolling with it. It's year 3 of pandemic. We're doing our best. And that's perfect timing because I just explained the whole thing about coaching and why it's so important for employees of color to have specific support from coaches who understand them, who they don't have to explain what it's like to be a person of color in the workplace, coaches who can provide the psychological safety that all too often is missing from our day-to-day when we're at work. Thank you, Lori, for telling me that you can hear me. So before I also kick it back, that you had mentioned the intro music, so I wanted to shout out Quintas Morera, who's a musician and an artist on YouTube, and you can also support the Patreon. It is his music that you heard in the intro video, which we love some funk. So look him up. I believe he's based in Brazil.
I love it.
Okay.
I wanted to say something else about coaching, the coaching piece. So one thing that is really important is that it's support of people of color and not necessarily from a space of deficit. Because oftentimes people say,
totally.
Oh, we've got to get the coaches, in order for them to survive, they've got to be coached because they're not as good. No, we want to coach them to elevate. And my business tagline is engage your hustle, to engage that hustle, to engage whatever they have in that space, as opposed to thinking that something is wrong. It's what do we have right, and how do we make that even more righter and amplify that piece. So don't always think of coaching as remedial, because coaching is absolutely a support structure that is there and can help elevate folks, period. So I want to just throw that in there.
Yes, I'm so glad you said that, because coaching can serve multiple purposes. Sometimes it is a remedial situation where somebody needs that. And I'm not saying it's what we're talking about today, but I do see it from like an amplifying and strengths-based, assets-based perspective. So you've got fans here welcoming you back, Paula. And yeah, I'm really excited. Folks, let us know if any of this resonates with you in the chat. Have you asked for this at work? Have you tried this at work? Are you interested in trying any of these strategies out at work? We love to know. And also, if you have any questions, pop them in the chat for us and we'll address what we can. We have already integrated in the questions that were submitted in advance into what we're going to cover. So yeah, let's get into it. We've got seven more solutions to share with all of you today. And we're not going to, they're not necessarily in like a sequential order. We're going to talk about them in a more fluid, organic way. But know that we will be sharing these strategies in a free one-sheet resource that we're going to send out in 2 installments on our newsletters. So we'll share with you how you can sign up for our newsletters briefly. But yes, so we want to know your thoughts about all these things. Paula, do you want to kick us off on today's 7 of the 10 strategies?
Sure. So again, underscoring the fact that these are not enough priority, because it really, when you're thinking about any strategy, it should be thinking about your particular organization, where you are right now on the continuum of thinking about DEI and retention, or even in planning for, recruiting folks into your organization. These are some strategies that can be helpful. These are not, there's probably 150 more, but we chose 10 that we thought were important to elevate. And I want to start with one that, as an attorney, when I was an employment lawyer, what I found is that if you want to have structures that support people staying and retention, you have to have policies and protocols, right? And so, yes, HR, right? Policies and protocols, but really, in terms of thinking, who has access to what, because policies and protocols are the equity piece of DEI, right? So you have diversity is
Yeah.
diverse. You bring them in or not. What you have in terms of your cohort is diverse, right? Maybe not as diverse as you want. Inclusion is making sure that they have the opportunity to ask, engage, right, and feel welcome in that space. But equity maintains those pieces well by policies and practices, right? What's the fairness that we bring into a space? And thinking about what kind of policies help with retention, it is things like, like who gets to return to work when are we, the things that have people feeling safe, um, time off. I'm thinking about other equity spaces. Oh, obviously, pay at its minimum. I'm like, at its minimum. What am I thinking of? Yeah.
The pay.
Pay is important, but other ways in which folks are compensated as well too. Because when we started talking about making sure we're not outsourcing a lot of resources that should be put into having people stay, one of the ways in which companies, and we talked about this before, mess up is they will say, hi, Cynthia, hi, Paula, we know that you're here in this organization. Can you do these extra things? And expect it as a
Oh,
part of our experience, as opposed to compensating for that. So to say, okay, if you're going to have, an affinity group, that a part of that means that you volunteering there means you get five extra days vacation, or 4 extra hours a day, whatever that thing is, and it's consistent and fair across the board. So whenever you're putting together those policies and those structures, making sure that they're fairly implemented, and that there's not more exceptions than there are rules. And so that's important to give framework to workspaces. It's work. It's not friendship and fun. It's work. So you have to have those things. And I wanted to start with that because it's sort of the most want one of them in my mind. I'm like, oh, but it's really important to maintaining a culture of equity, of fairness, and of inclusion.
right. Which is what I think we hear from companies all the time is they want to build that equitable, inclusive culture of belonging. And this is how you do it. And I hope folks were taking notes when you're breaking down the diversity, equity, inclusion components of this, because that is so key. And I also want to say that a lot of times I talk to leaders in companies and they're like, they think equity equals equal. And that's not the case, because if you're thinking of it that way, it's always going to keep perpetuating the status quo that exists now, which is unequal, exists now, which is very inequitable and unequal. So we have to think about the background of where everybody's coming from as far as these policies that create and support and make it possible to have a more equitable workplace, which also means like flexibility on a top of the pay thing, right? Considering where people are coming from. Folks of color tend to more often be supporting multiple family units in their communities, and that comes with its own set of challenges. And so flexibility is something that I think our clients, like individual and organizational, are looking to build in more in an equitable way. So I'm glad you talked about that, and something I raised in my white paper too, which is available for download on our website. We can talk about that in a bit, but I want to also amp up some of our folks in the chat. This person says they've access to these type of things now, but before they didn't, and that's the reason they left those companies. Hello. So we've got people right here who are sharing like this is it for them, because prior companies didn't invest in them and offer these things in this way. They voted with their feet and are somewhere else now. This other person signing up for any training that becomes available for you. And development's really important to this person and what they look for in a company too. So I hope that leaders are thinking about this as they consider what you just shared, Paula. And also, yeah, don't overburden and reburden people of color and also women to do this type of work. Like one of the questions we got before today was like, how do you make sure that your DEI policies and things extend beyond this event, this affinity event, this other, fireside chat and all this. And we're coming to you at near the end of Women's History Month, and I'll tell you, I'm tired.
Exhausted.
I'm tired.
Exhausted.
Yeah. We've all been doing a lot of events,
Mhm.
and guess who's organizing those events from the organizational side? Women. Guess who's running the tech behind the scenes for these events? Women. Guess who's advocating on like Paul and my behalf for us to get paid our speaker fees and things like that? Women. So I just think that's something we all should think about how we do Women's History Month collectively and all the history months.
Yeah, every commemoration is, it's an easy way to show that sort of visible, we care about diversity, and particularly since 2020, there's an event every week, and there's something that's connected to DEI, and those are important, right? So I'm not at all saying that events shouldn't happen, because it does bring a spotlight, and it helps to kind of bridge the gap between internal and external efforts, oftentimes, if you are able to share resources about events externally. However, it can't be just that, right? It can't be only the flashy, the 90 minutes. It's got to be, what are you doing in your day to day? What is the experience of your employees? And, at a minimum, some of these things can just be as simple as checking in. When I look at some of the comments that say, I didn't realize I didn't have those things, and that's kind of part of the reason why I left. It's, you don't know what you don't know until you see what the other options are externally. And now with the great revelation, which is what people call the great resignation,
Mm-hmm.
people, folks are talking much more about the different resources that they have at different organizations, how they're being treated, what the culture is. It's sort of that Yelp Glassdoor culture that's
Right.
that is benefiting, people of color, because before there weren't these sort of systems and structures that allowed that resources in terms of feedback to be external to the company. So I'm glad.
Yes. I love that too because that makes me think of the power of transparency. And then another one of our solutions is communications training. And so many of my clients come to us and they're like, yeah, our company espouses a policy and a value, a core value of transparency. And yet, what they're getting is not transparency. So that tells me there's a communication breakdown at probably multiple levels in this situation, which tells me that the top leadership is not, they're working off a different definition of transparency than everybody in their day to day, and that needs to be closed. And also probably there are places where they could do a better job of communicating across difference, because the truth of it is vertical segregation that we have in most companies, with lots of white folks and lots of men at the top, lots of people of color and lots of women at the bottom. There's this expectation, and it's a burden on I think women and people of color to be able to acquiesce and communicate in the white supremacy, white dominant, white male way. And there is not an equal opposite effort in the other direction. And so comms training, that's why that's one of the things that's central to what we talk about, and what we do with companies. Um, and I'm sorry if my feed is choppy. The internet is real in and out. And so if you can't hear me, let us know in the chat. We'll try to fix some things on the back end. Um, so yeah, that's why comms training is one of our top 10 solutions for companies, and I write about it in the white paper as well. So
Do you want to talk? I mean, I think maybe drill down a little bit on the comms training, because what actually is it? So you can say, you need to know how to communicate, right? We all do, right? But it's thinking about modulating your communication for the who you're trying to connect with. And so if you think about, we want one of the resources, we want one of our strategies is to have additional professional development and training, right? And so I'll have a leader say to me, well, Paula, we put up on the whiteboard, or we sent that email that said we have this training available. And so And I say, okay, why do you think that maybe folks did not connect with that? Well, I don't know, but we have all these things and they're not listening. How you're communicating. Sometimes you need to double down on your communication, make a special, send it from somebody else. There are different ways for different groups that sometimes you have in order to engage. And I'm not saying that's across the board, but I do know that you can't do the same thing for everybody and assume that it's going to work. And so if you're really trying to make a concerted effort for people of color in particular to access the resources that you have, then it may be that you send out an initial thing and then somebody else forwards it and responds, and that's a part of, that's a one and two. Or at your company meeting, you or in your individual department meeting, you then say, I'm not sure if you all saw the email, but this is something that we really want you to invest in, right? It's multi-layered communication to make sure you're impacting
Yep.
the groups in which you're trying to retain.
Yeah, I love that strategy because it is true that sometimes, I don't know if anyone has ever experienced this, but thanks for the feedback in the chat, Stephanie and Lori. Like sometimes I'm able to hear a message from one person and I'm not able to hear it from another person. And there's lots of layers to that. I don't know if anyone's ever experienced anything similar. So there is that piece. And then there also is it's actually way more granular in a way too of the how the messaging is done. And so anyone who does anything that's like marketing or PR, like there's a reason that companies have internal communications folks. It's they're supposed to bridge these gaps. And sometimes the truth is the gaps are chasms. So I have worked with this client before. I'll just give an example anonymously, like, and they were offering this great resource for their employees of color, but the employees of color were not, they were not signing up, they were not biting at this, at the bait or whatever. They weren't availing themselves of this great offer. And I looked at it and I was like, yeah, this offer is really great. I wonder why they're not signing up. This is a little strange. And then I asked to see their comms of how they shared about this. And in 2 seconds, I was like, this is why. Like the way that it was written, the way it was presented, I immediately could see like 10 reasons why folks of color would be like, that's not for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing. We need people who have that cultural competency to be able to see through it and be like, this is the problem. Try this. This also needs to be changed or tweaked. This is not accessible language. This signals for the white folks, or this signals for people of a certain class or a background or whatever. We all have our blind spots. And this is the whole thing about bringing in folks and doing the development, doing the training, because if we don't continually improve, we're always going to have these blind spots and we won't even know about them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which you can find the recording for part one. It's on our YouTubes and I think also on both of our websites. Is it on yours as well?
It may not be yet. I'm working on it. But if you go to your YouTube, which I'll pull it up.
Yeah, it's Paula Edgar. Wait, no, it's YouTube. That's for it's the Paula
The
Edgar.
It is on there. It will soon be on my YouTube as well, but give me a little bit of time, please.
So,
But yes, I'm glad folks want to hear about the first part.
we're going to talk about
Yeah.
the mental health piece right now.
Yes, let's do it.
So, okay. We are still in the middle of a global pandemic. I know that there are some places who are trying to forget that, but we are still in the middle of a global pandemic, which has had a detrimental impact on communities of color. I'm going to say that again. We are still in the middle of a global pandemic, which has had a detrimental impact on communities of color. As such, we cannot act as if everything is fine because everything is not fine. And if you think about in particular the impact of the last 2 years, right? Pretty much, Cynthia and I have talked about this. Almost every conversation that I have with a potential client, they start off with in the wake of George Floyd, right? That's where they start the conversation and as that being their awakening to understanding that there are societal issues in terms of racism and structural bias and all of those things. And for communities of color, we knew that there was a problem, right? That was a collective trauma that we all experienced, right? And it did signify a shift for many, many folks. But it's important to know that it was that the multiple, issues that we had in terms of protests and murders and all of that, and then the pandemic, right?
Yep.
And then in the pandemic, this realization, again, I call it the great revelation, that I don't have to stay here if I'm not being treated well, not getting resources and accessing opportunity, I can go someplace else where they, even if it's incremental, they'll treat me a little bit better. I'm going to do that. So
Yeah.
that's that agency that comes from it. And within all of that, that the external piece of perhaps having to take care of folks who are sick, for people who are parents, thinking about the external piece of school and having virtual school. There were so many moving pieces. There still are so many moving pieces around
Yeah.
support, which we know have predominantly also affected the intersection of women of color as opposed to just people of
Yes.
color as well. So how can we not be in a space where we need mental health support? Right. And so when I have conversations with folks like, well, they're fine. It seems like they're fine. Well, who? Because they're not here. Right?
Yeah.
Because they're gone, right? Because you don't understand and realize the fact that this is something that, it is our base humanity that we should look on. Empathy is a huge, important leadership competency. And if it is not within the lens in which you're looking at all of your employees, and obviously for the conversation we're having today, particularly for people of color, then there's a blind spot, there is a chasm, to your point earlier, in who you say you are and how you actually show up. And so you must have mental health support, whether that's through EAP, whether that's through programming, whether that's through wellness, or all of the above, in order to say we care, we see you, we care about you, and we want to support you, not just because of what you do, but to make sure that you show up in a way that you can be your best self, both here and at home, because many of us are at home doing this.
It's a falsehood that there's a real barrier or boundary really anymore functionally between home and life and work life. I mean, there's so much blending and fluidity back and forth, and I love the kind of hard examples that you gave there, and also J.Y. McCoy says we can't shy away from the importance of mental health at all levels and roles within the organization, which is exactly what we're saying. Thank you for putting it so succinctly. And I love that you mentioned the EAP employee assistance programs and supporting people for their therapy. Like actually, here's a stipend or here's an allotment, here's a discretionary budget that you can use for your therapy, because 9 times out of 10 when I talk to people about therapy, they're there using it to talk about work. And so I mean, that realization I had a couple of years ago blew my mind, because I was like, well, your work should be paying for all the thousands of dollars of therapy that you're paying for, however much it is, because you're spending all of your time talking about and strategizing about work. So I love that. And then what's some of the other mental health programming or other supports that you've seen or recommend to companies to do?
One of my clients, and they did this without me, so I can't take credit, but I'll take credit because they are my clients. So I gave them that inclusion lens. They decided that because, a lot of times people will get a mental health support person, a therapist, et cetera, or a psychologist, et cetera, and they're not covered by insurance. What they did was it was like a day every month where HR would support helping them to submit reimbursements. Like
Oh my God, that's amazing.
I thought it was so innovative because I know for myself, I mean, I have my own business, but even for myself, because my husband, is employed and we do submit things to, it's annoying to have to fill out the forms and do all this stuff and get it. And so to have that resource to say, this is what you do, this is how you do it, to make it even incrementally easier takes away a burden off. And so I love that it was something they thought about. They heard what was being said. This is
Oh,
this, right? This hurts, help. And then they responded. And that is, if more people just took that equation, it would be
yeah.
so much easier. I would love to hear if there are anything, things that are being done within the people who are joining us. What are y'all doing? What are folks doing in your workplaces to support mental health or other things to make it easier right now with the burden of all of the things we're experiencing societally, to navigate? Is there any innovations that you're seeing that you want to share with all of us? I'd love to see that.
Yeah, and also if you do have questions in the moment, we're happy to address things too. So I mean, I think the mental health piece is paramount because, as someone said in the chat, it's so fundamental and core to who we are. And we're not going to function anywhere near optimally and or be productive if we're not well. So I'm really heartened to hear whenever organizations and companies do have any type of wellness initiative, but it does need to be the right things. Something that also does harm is when they don't follow the equation that you just said, Paula, of like you think of a solution, you offer it,
Mhm.
is when they ask a question and then they're not. This is a comms thing too. It's like you ask a question, you're listening to respond, you're not listening to understand,
Ugh,
which is that empathy piece. And so if you're listening to respond, you already have your pre-established ideas of this is what I can do or not do. If you're not communicating that, it does not work when you then like propose your solution, because then the person who just shared with you what they need is like, did you not hear me? you
remember,
know?
remember at the beginning, I said people want to be fully heard and fairly treated, right?
Yeah.
It's within that. There's some fantastic responses in the chat about what people are doing, and this is great. So I see somebody else is elevating in the EAP employee assistance programs. I have another client who were like, well, we're just going to continue to share the employee assistance program, and sometimes they'll send you at the beginning, like when you start working or when your benefits change, they'll send you that magnet you can put on the refrigerator that says like EAP. And so one of my clients was like, we're just going to resend the magnets. And I was like, the magnets aren't working, right? If people are not
Yeah.
coming, right? There's got to be another way you communicate that this is a resource. And what they did was one of the leaders said, I use EAP. Again, it's modeling empathy as well. It's I am one of you and I also need to support you. And that's an important strategy as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a key piece also too, with to weave it back to the coaching solution, is that folks are more likely to participate in the coaching when they see other folks at work doing it, especially if they are leaders, especially if they're in the C-suite, the ELT, the executive leadership teams, because then it goes against that stigma that this is like a remedial thing, that this is a punishment or whatever. So I love that piece of it. We also furnish sharing. Boston Beer Company has implemented Modern Health for its employees. Yay, wellness coach. That is so great. Yes, other type of coaching other than career and executive is also doable. And people are responding really well. Thank you for sharing that. And says unlimited vacay. Take the time when you need, as long as you need. And I also know another company that does PTO and vacation by hour. So you can take a couple hours at a time, 1 hour at a time. If you need, got to pick up your kid from school or something. There's a COVID outbreak at school. You got to pick up your kid, and suddenly your kid is home. Your child is home for a couple of days. Like, it's that level of flexibility and agility is what we're talking about. That's necessary. We ask it of our employees. Like, we should be able to do our best to provide it for them too.
I love it.
And thanks for sharing that link.
Somebody else
Um,
shared about flexible work arrangements, and that's something that we have in terms of our strategies as well, right? That is a part of listening to what folks need, right? We've heard so many articles that have come out to say that many people of color feel like they're more productive and they would rather stay at home versus go back into the office, right? Or have a hybrid schedule that allows them to interact not fully. And
yes.
as a diversity consultant, I know part of the reason is because in the office, it is having to navigate microaggressions, it's having to code switch, it's the weight of all of those things, for folks who are from the AAPI community, it's fear of having to actually get to work and what that means in terms of violence, right? Like there's so many things that are going on, and so to have a flexible work arrangement says we hear you. We also understand in the past 2 years that we have seen that we can thrive when we are virtual and we can navigate different spaces so that the hybrid can work by listening to what you're saying, and so that is fantastic. It's fantastic.
Yes. I love that. And like, even just hearing you lay out like the tip of the iceberg of what it's actually like for folks of color, including LGBTQ plus folks, especially for trans folks in the workplace, like people who are really not like, oh, I don't know. Whenever I hear people say you can bring your full self to work, I'm like, hold on, because it's not true for all people. It's not true for all people of color. And we have to stop this falsehood again of like you can really do that, because it's not equal across the board, because we don't live in that world yet. So yeah, I love that how into the weeds we're getting in this conversation, and folks are sharing all these things in the chat. So I mean, we've kind of hit on flexible work arrangements. One thing I want to point out too that we can talk about, and please let us know if you have questions in the chat. We can take a few more of those. Management training. Ooh, I love this one because when you and I prepped for this, we talked about how crucial middle managers are. Like middle management, you've got the direct reports, you also have other leaders you report to above you. That role is so integral to an organization and in building an equitable and a healthy and like wellness first kind of culture for everybody, including people of color at work. And yet, all too often, and it's a complicated problem. I'll get into it in a second, but like all too often that person is not the conduit. I think that the language you used probably before is like they could either be a conduit, or they could be a blocker, something like that.
They can be a barrier or a facilitator, right?
There you go.
Yeah.
I'm
So
using the thesaurus.com words.
when when you think about how people become managers, for the most part, they become managers by doing a good job in the jobs that they have, right? So it's like, oh, you've done
Exactly.
a great job, we're going to give you some more responsibilities. But there's never the, why don't we give you some resources, some structure around how to do this well? And then you put,
Mhm.
folks become middle managers, and then they are managing folks who we're trying to have their best, be their best selves, right? To come to their full selves, to your point. But if you don't have people who are able to listen and to, provide feedback and to connect and to delegate and all the things that you need to do to be a good manager, and yet you're saying we're making you responsible for diversity, equity, inclusion. What I find often is people, they're costing, what? You're paying me just to show up and make sure these folks get the stuff done, versus help me to be better, help me to communicate, help me to understand why this is important organizationally, and how then can I do this better. That's when the facilitation happens, as opposed to the barrier.
Yes, I love that. And like, um, it's also not only for the middle managers, really, and somebody else pointed this out in the chat earlier, but we need all this type of supports at all of the levels, and it may look slightly different at all the levels because that's the different reality that folks are living in. But yeah, you cannot task people with being like, oh, carry out a DEI policy or initiative, and they don't actually have the support or the training or the tools or the resources. And we've both like coached and worked with leaders at all levels, and the need there for that ongoing training and support, including inclusive management training, including sometimes people need their DEI executive coach that can be that one safe space to be your face totally up. That's one area I'm heartened to see is kind of growing a bit, and more leaders are actually hiring their DEI executive coaches. Because, and as Stephanie pointed out, shout out to Embrace Change team member Stephanie Heath. She's amazing. Everybody should follow Stephanie. Um, Stephanie pointed out, like, it's not true that we can all bring ourselves to work. And if people don't feel it to be true, then it's not true. So thank you, Stephanie, for putting it that way so clearly. What are some of the kind of management training initiatives that you've seen be a success, Paula?
So you teed it up a little bit. So inclusive management training is key, and I think not just the collective management, but also inclusive management paired with coaching, right? So you're learning the themes, you're learning some of the best practices, and then you're getting support with actually putting them into practice, right. So I tried to be inclusive today, Paula. It didn't really work. Can we talk about why? Right. And I get a lot of that. If you to have somebody who you can be open with, and to say, I made a mistake today, or I'm afraid to say this thing because I don't think it'll go well, is an important thing. There's a lot of my empathy sits with leaders right now in a very strong way, obviously across the board, but in a strong way, because there's a lot of change happening really quickly in workspaces, and folks who have entered in the workplace in the 70s, 80s are going through huge change right now because of the multiple amount of generations that are in the workplace, because of societal shifts and the need for different communication that was not the case when they enter the workspace, right? So we just assume that you're going to snap your fingers and it's going to happen. And so providing that support is important. Having an understanding of what the mission and vision of the organization is, then from there, solidifying and connecting the mission vision with the structures that you support in training, in management training. This is how to delegate, this is how to give feedback properly. And
Oh, wow.
right, all of
Huge.
those
Yeah.
pieces that are so important to the employee experience. And then to say from that, I don't want to expect you to do one Zumba class and be skinny. I'm gonna give you a Zumba class and I'm gonna give you a personal coach to come through and support you in your individual journey. That is sort of the key equation to this.
Yeah, because it's really unrealistic, and it's also a function, I think, of white supremacy culture in the workplace to think, I'm going to do this thing once and it's going to be solved.
Girl,
No, we
girl,
know that's
if
no.
only, if only.
If only we wouldn't be where we are now. We would have waved the magic wand or whatever. And that's I think the expectation sometimes people have, which is why they don't properly allocate their resources. Remember, I said that first thing, allocating resources, money, time, and infrastructure, was going to undergird all of this. Yeah, this is why. Because we can't expect things to, like, on the first try, it magically works. Of course, we would love that, and it's great if that happens. But 99% of the time, that's not going to be the case. So I'm happy that you like raised that, and I want to pick up on that, how to give feedback piece, because it's so hard. And again, back to that communications solution, and also the training for managers at all levels. I always tell my clients when they're giving or receiving feedback and they're not really sure what to do with it, I'm like, more often than not, feedback says more about the person giving it than the person receiving it. And that's not how we're trained to think about feedback. Like, a lot of us as people of color, as women of color, we're so, like, we hold it so carefully. We take everything so seriously. We take notes. We're like super earnest about it. And that's a function of our socialization and conditioning.
Mhm.
And then to find out that, like, but I did all these things, and over time, and the goalpost is getting moved back on me again,
Mhm.
or I'm still not getting that raise, but so and so other person, there's budget for them. Like,
I mean, we could do a series just on feedback. I actually just finished writing an article on this because I'm so frustrated by this. This is one of the key places where I say I can tell you all the things you need to do, but if you don't actually take the time and start to implement them, it will not happen. It does not happen on its own. And so your point about feedback being more about the person, of course, what happens is in terms of feedback, you're responding to not just your preferences, but also your biases.
yeah,
So
yeah,
if I say, look, I like this paper, but you put it on, your font is 12 font and I prefer 11 font. Even if I don't say that, that's a part of how I'm looking at your work product. And so I often will share with leaders to say, tell people your quirks. It's like relationship advice. Tell people your quirks up front in your relationship. Hey, I don't know. I
mm,
like half-inch margins. I like whatever the thing is. And I prefer that you send me a message before you come walking into my office. Tell people how you want to be communicated with. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily always respond, but it's important for them to know. That's very different than here's what they're supposed to do. They have actually done it, but you are then saying you haven't hit the benchmark, or you say nothing. Like
uh,
that, people of color in particular, there's a look. I want feedback. I want affirmation because because of imposter syndrome, I might feel like I'm not supposed to be there in the first place. I don't know what's going on, and so to hear I'm doing well, or this could have been done a little bit differently,
right.
is important in order for folks to grow and to feel as if they're able to flex in their positions. But the thing that I hear the most, especially now, especially since 2020, is Cynthia. Drum roll, please.
Yes. What is it?
It is, I don't want to give feedback because I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing and or being sued.
Oh my god! Just heard that from somebody this morning. I was gonna say that.
I've
They're
seen.
afraid of microaggressing someone, so they say nothing.
So my thought is this: if you really want to retain people of color and you don't say anything, and you don't try, you're not going to retain them anyway. So you might as well try and make a mistake and learn and to do better versus not doing it at all. Like it just,
Yeah.
to me, it's like, I get the fear, right? Nobody wants to say the wrong thing, right? It's right. We are living in, to your point, a white supremacist society that allows us that perfectionism is what our goalpost is at all times. So yes, we're going to sit there and say, hello, yes, this is a paper. I think it was fine, right? But what folks need to hear is, because I've heard you speak and I understand that you know this concept, this paper should have reflected that more. And it would have been great if you made point A, point B. Like, feedback needs to be actionable and constructive, and it doesn't always have to be bad. Tell people how good they do so they do it more. You obviously, you see I'm getting hyped up about this because it's just so frustrating to me that the fear prevents people from doing anything versus to do it and be okay with getting it wrong and then doing better next time. That's a part of the nature of being inclusive in the first place. You're never going to get it all right, ever.
It's part of the nature of being a human being.
Absolutely.
And like we have to just acknowledge that that's going to happen. I've made plenty of mistakes. I will make mistakes in the future. And yet the worst thing to do is what you said, is to take no action, and also to not communicate with someone, because also what message is that sending to that person? Like, we also communicate non-verbally, something we haven't talked about. So yeah, like we can feel the vibe even through screens and thousands of miles when someone says absolutely not a single word. And what message does that send? Like, I've had clients before, which we talked about this in the teaser conversation in January. You know, her supervisor, her immediate supervisor, refused to speak directly to her simply because she's a Black woman the whole time she worked there. And guess what? You know, that company did not retain that person. And she's highly talented. Like, the next place is super happy to have her. You know what I mean? So it's, these things have real ramifications, and we can feel that energy when people's communication is, I don't know, like not coming from this place of recognizing our humanity, not seeing us, not hearing us, and not recognizing the fact that it's okay to make a mistake, and let's try to, you know, be compassionate about making mistakes and failing and learning and doing better and striving.
I tell leaders, you can't outsource love. You can't, right? You can't, and right, you can't say, go ahead and love that person for me, please. You can't. Like, you have to be the person. And I think of being empathetic and providing feedback and providing opportunities as our way of loving folks internally. And yes, it sounds very like I'm gonna light a candle and do yoga, but I don't care. The point is that people want to be fairly treated, and that's the way that we can love our employees so that they will stay. Who wants to stay in a place where they're being, traumatized or, subject to abuse because of microaggressions and neglect and all these things? If I have a choice right now, and my choice is to stay where I am being mistreated or not treated, then I'm going to go someplace where they're at least going to try and
Right.
and maybe get it wrong, and then are open to my feedback to say, could we do this differently? Can this happen in this way? Every institution that wants to be inclusive and to retain people of color has to have that open. It's vulnerable. It is. It's risky. It's a little scary,
Yes.
but it's also different than what we've done before. You cannot have a shift in culture by doing the exact same thing you've always been doing for the last 50 years and think, well, I know this time is going to be different, girl. No, it's not.
Yeah, I know. We gotta stop kind of like just trying to brute force the things and accept that the only constant is change, and we have to rise to meet the reality that exists today, which is we are in a global workplace, we're in a virtual remote workplace, we are in a multi-generational workplace, and like all these things and several more that I'm not going to list out. But I'm so amped also by what folks are saying in the chat, like anything is better than nothing, and something imperfect can be improved upon. Correct. And thank you, Nicole.
Yeah.
And Stephanie, I think, was really resonating with these conversations about empathy and how people can really feel. And that where it starts is like in this place of genuine, being able to be a little bit vulnerable with things. So, I mean, everything that we're talking about, I think, needs to be infused throughout all of the solutions, like the policies, the training, the professional development, the coaching, the action, taking action, and how you communicate and think about what it is you're trying to convey, and be open to feedback.
So, and one of the things that we talked about that is important is also data, right? And
Yeah.
and metrics. And so Cynthia knows I'm not a fan of gathering data myself. I'm always saying, like, this is not my magic. Someone else can collect data and I can talk about it, but I do love qualitative data. I love to hear about the experiences of people within the workplace. I love to hear about the challenges, because while data will tell one story in terms of the quantitative, qualitative data also gives you context to the numbers that you're
Mhm.
seeing. And one of the pieces of data that I think that folks need to be much more thoughtful about is using exit interviews. So I'll tell you
Hello.
a strategy that I have been encouraging some of my clients to do. So when you have attrition, and obviously folks have been having attrition a lot of people of color, and you go to report, well, 16.5 of our, people of color have gone in the last three. What I say, put their pictures up on that PowerPoint.
Mm.
Personalize the data, make it tangible, trigger the empathy so that it's not just, oh, it's a number, it's a stat. Because in the legal profession, I hear all the time, well, it's been an incremental shift. I want to talk about the who left,
Right.
why did they leave, right? Not
Right.
just the data. Obviously, that's important. The numbers are important, but it's more for me the experience. And when you do, I am often outsourced to do exit interviews because they'll tell me the truth versus telling somebody else, right,
Okay.
who's there.
Mhm.
And using that data to say, okay, we have now 3 people who've indicated they never got feedback other than at their annual review. Now what? Now what are we going to do? Right? We have to be
Mhm.
responsive to that. And so that's an important, we have to gather data and don't let it just sit there. Use it to improve upon your strategies.
Right. I mean, the collecting and tracking of data is like necessary, but not sufficient at all. Like it's the minimum of what you need to be doing in order to know what is happening on a larger scale level. And then I love that idea of putting someone's face to a story of elevating and putting qualitative data on the same level as quantitative. And that's another white supremacy culture thing too, is to like put the numbers up on a pedestal, but not talk about the human beings that is actually supposed to be describing. And Kamala also a great idea about personalizing the data. Thank you for sharing that. And thanks for your affirmations, Asha. So yeah, like doing that is super important. And we have to, I don't know, if nothing else, I think company leaders, official and unofficial, like we got to know ourselves. You have to have an accurate picture of what's actually going on in your day to day and thinking about it in a people of color centered way. And is so powerful. And if you lift those folks up, everybody is going to be lifted up, including.
Say, say it again, Cynthia, because say it again. Because every single time I go into an organization and say exactly that, they will, well, what are we going to say about this group and this group? Listen to me. When you put that lens on of inclusion with the focus on groups who have been traditionally under resourced, right, and underrepresented,
Yep.
everybody lifts from it, right? But it's
Correct.
in an equity space than in an equality space, right? It's understanding that once you say that who you are as an organization, who you are as a leader, and how you want the experience of work of people in the workplace to be, everybody is benefited from it. Everybody.
Yes. I know. I mean, I know it may take some time to sink in, so that's fine. Like, for those of you who understand that in the chat, like, share it with one of your leaders if it's safe and psychologically safe for you to do that. And then maybe over time, if they hear it enough ways from enough folks, again, there's that communications thing, like, maybe it will start to sink in. And if they do see the stories and the humanity behind the folks that may be leaving or not, like, maybe we'll have some hope there if we all work together. Understand that we have to try our best and we will make mistakes and all of that, but I think that at this point we've shared, have we talked about the 10th one, the pathways to leadership solution?
I think
Not really, right?
we kind of infused it into other,
We sort of did.
go ahead, go for it.
Yeah. So, and for folks who maybe missed part of this, or if you're in and out, we are going to create a one-sheet resource for free that we're going to share on both of our newsletters. So make sure to sign up for our newsletters. I'll put the info up again. You can sign up for Paula's newsletter at paulaedgar.com. paulaedgar.com. And you can sign up for mine at the footer of my website, embracechange.nyc, as well as download our free white paper on the Great Resignation or the Great Revelation if you click the banner at the top. So definitely get on those so that you can get all of these 10 solutions in one tightly packaged place. And yeah, the pathways to leadership or career pathing or whatnot, as you might have heard it called, is to say that people of color really want to excel. We want to do great for our companies, and we do great work for our companies. And we want to know that over time, there will be opportunities for us to grow, for us to further learn, develop, build on our strengths, contribute to the company in all sorts of ways. And the fact that a lot of companies, like, I don't know, I'm not sure what's going through their minds exactly, but it might be a part of this trying to outsource something. But that's not, you can't outsource somebody's professional development and growth and trajectory if you want to keep them in your company. If they don't see, if they think the road ends after like the next year or in this particular role, they're probably already thinking about leaving.
Oh
So
yeah.
if you're serious about retaining talent and promoting and hiring from within, and having a more inclusive and equitable culture, then you absolutely have to make sure that every single employee of color of yours has a plan that is co-created with them, for what, like, where they could be in 2, 3, 5 years at the company. Otherwise, you're signaling through your communication and lack thereof that you don't want them to stay, and so they will leave.
Yep. You
So
outcast and you outcast. Bars. Somebody put that on Twitter. So anyway, I mean, when you were talking, I was sitting here like it is chillingly simple that if you listen and watch, hear and respond, it will shift. What we're hearing is that people are not being afforded the opportunity to give feedback, and for it to be considered and perhaps implemented, and for cultures to shift. And so if you don't do those things, then you can't go back and complain, which is the other piece. Well, they'll be like, well, Paula left. She's gone. I really miss Paula. Paula tried to stay. She did, right? Paula said, please give me this thing, this thing, this thing. Can we
you
talk
were
about what
screaming it probably through
right?
a megaphone.
Yeah, and that's hard. And I want to just, I know we're coming to a close. I want to just to end with something that my therapist says all the time, which is growth begins where comfort ends. You cannot be comfortable and shift cultures, because it's not how you make change. It's not how you advance change. And you also have to hold people accountable. So if you say you're gonna do it, do it. That's all.
That's right. It's very simple. It is chillingly simple, like you said. And one thing that you shared when we were prepping too is that, like, if folks don't pay attention to what is happening right now, if they try to like put their head in the sand and just think that, oh, it'll bounce back in like a couple months, no, you're going to fall victim to the great resignation, the great reshuffle, the great revelation, whatever you want to call it. That is going to come for your company. For those who do like quantitative data, it's shown to be especially bad for companies that have employees of 50 or over. So if your company is that size, like, you're going to have a lot of issues. Think about the costs. The cost of somebody walking out the door and then recruiting a new person, where right now recruiters are turning away searches for the first time in I don't even know how long, because there's just too many open roles. So anyway, download the white paper if you want to read more about it at embracechange.nyc. On all of the platforms. Her YouTube is fire, IG is fire, Twitter, and I'm on all the platforms as well. Here you can find us. Obviously, you can connect with us on LinkedIn. And make sure to, be on both of our newsletters so that you can get this free resource that we're going to share, and take it back to your companies, take it back to your leadership. If you're not officially in the leadership yet, we want to see you there. And thanks to everyone who joined today. This has been an incredible journey, 3-part journey of why companies fail to retain people of color. And we'll see you on the internet. But thank you everyone for joining. And thanks, JY.
Bye.
Look at that. Bye.